Today we're going to get to the apostles, and we're going to talk about two apostles individually, specifically, and that is Matthew and John. So we'll start with Matthew. Matthew details, there's lots of things. Again, we're cherry picking here, but I'm going to zoom in here on Matthew 23, where Matthew details the practices of the Judaizers, the Judaism that was taking place in the first century A.D. Now, this is very specific. These are practices that arose among these Pharisees, and specifically the Pharisees, that came out of the Maccabean revolt. So the Maccabean revolt's a few hundred years before the time of Christ. And so we only have a period of time of, after the Maccabean revolt comes these Pharisees, and then they're around, and they're doing these things in the first century. And then in 70 A.D., Jerusalem is destroyed. And the way that the Pharisees operated and what they taught and the things that they did in the temple and in Jerusalem, you're not going to know about that unless you lived during that time. So the things that Matthew talks about in Matthew 23, if they're accurate, are going to be really good evidence that he did live in and around Jerusalem during the first century A.D. So look at what he says in Matthew 23. By the way, this is also in Mark and Luke also record much of the same information, but Matthew's very extensive, and Matthew's one of the apostles. So I chose to go to Matthew 23 for this. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees, the scribes being the scholars of the Pharisees. They were scholars. Not all of them were Pharisees, but here the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Now that's an interesting statement. They sit in Moses' seat. We'll come back to that. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not, for they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all the works that they do for to be seen of men, they make broad their phylacteries, make a mental note of that, and enlarge the borders of their garments, and love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be ye not called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. And call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer them that are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. You're understanding that the Pharisees took the law of God and weaponized it to force other people to not only see them as righteous, but to financially support them because of their superior righteousness. You can't pray for 3 hours like we do, so instead, it's the least you can do to put money in the little box in front of me while I'm praying for 3 hours, since you're not praying for 3 hours. And they're causing widows, they're devouring widows' houses, making them feel like if you would just give a little bit more, then God would come and He would help you. He would bring you into more prosperity if you just give a little bit more to the Pharisees. Verse 15, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourself. Well, that's quite a statement. We'll talk more about this on Sunday, because we're actually going to be on a parallel passage in Luke on Sunday, God willing. Verse 16, woe unto you, ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. Ye fools and blind. By the way, these are all very interesting statements, but I want to give you the whole thing really very quickly here. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold of the temple, or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing, but whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon the altar, he is guilty. The Pharisees made the big thing the money that people were giving. Money, material things, that mattered. the spiritual things were not important. You can swear by spiritual things and then go back on your oath and it doesn't matter. But if you swore by the physical gold or physical offerings, you can't go back on your oath. Ye fools and blind, for whether it is greater the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it, and by all things thereon. And whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it, and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by the heaven sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth thereon. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin. So little spices that they would purchase, they would say, oh, but you got to pay tithe on that. They'd be overbearing in their application of the tithe laws of the Old Testament, of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, woe unto you, ye scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. The scribes and Pharisees, Jesus is saying, you are extortioners, you are corrupt on the inside, but you clean up the outside real nice. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of uncleanness. Even so also outwardly ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within you are full of hypocrisy. We could keep going, but those are the main things I wanted to hit. Now, we could actually go through all of this, but I'm going to cherry pick a few of these things and show you that Matthew clearly had to live during this time. And let me give you a few reasons why. We'll start with the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was discovered in 150 BC. They outline strict purity and legal interpretations by a group that would later become the Pharisees. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a little bit after the time of the Maccabean revolt, and so you're 150 BC. You're not quite 200 years before the ministry of Christ in 30 AD, and so when we found these Dead Sea Scrolls, many years after the time of Christ, of course, we found them. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found, I think, in the 1900s, if I'm not mistaken. But at any rate, the Dead Sea Scrolls go all the way back to before the time of Christ and show that from after the Maccabean revolt in Israel, there was this group of Essenes who were very strict and would eventually become the Pharisees, and had this. So we can actually prove this. Now here's the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are some of the greatest pieces of evidence for the Bible, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls we actually find whole copies of books of the Bible from the Old Testament, books that contain clear prophecy about the Messiah, and these are dated before Jesus showed up. So it's not like somebody went back and changed it. We'll talk more about this in transmission. But here's a picture. There's some of the Dead Sea Scrolls there. Here's another picture of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is an actual Dead Sea Scroll. It's from what I can discern from the pictures I was getting online. How about this? Teflon cases. They found these Teflon cases. Look at what it says in verse 5. But all their works they do for to be seen of men, they make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. Now, in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, the Jews were told in the law of God that they were to bind the law of God upon their foreheads as the frontlets before their eyes. Now, this seems to obviously be a figurative thing. You're supposed to always have the law of God in your mind. It's supposed to be on your arm. Like when you go do stuff, it should be in accordance with the law of God. So Jesus here claims that they were making broad their phylacteries, or boxes in which they would take the law of God and write down some of the law of God and put it in boxes and wrap it around their head. We've actually found these boxes. They confirm the use of phylacteries and fringes in the Second Temple period, as Jesus described. So What he was saying is that they would take these boxes that they would strap around their head, but the Pharisees would have big boxes, because I have more of the law of God in there, And so they would show off their righteousness because they had a big phylactery. Only somebody living during that time would know about this. This is during the Second Temple period. All right, let's talk about Josephus. Josephus is a great source of information for proving the authenticity of the Bible and the accuracy of the Bible. He wrote about the Pharisees. Josephus was born just a little after Jesus died, rose from the dead, ascended into heaven, probably 37, 38 AD. So he was in his 30s when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. So when he writes about the destruction of Jerusalem and all this, he's writing from a first century perspective. And guess what his perspective is? The same perspective as the gospel writers. Like, he's giving the same information because they were all alive in the first century. This is very obvious. So he writes about the Pharisees, and he mentions that they were known for their exactness in interpreting the law, in contrast with the Sadducees, who were a little bit more liberal. They were a little more loose. The Pharisees were very, very strict, and even Josephus mentions this. And that's what Jesus says in Matthew 23. How about this? In the synagogues, we found these stone seats that are known and called the Moses' seat, found in synagogues like Chorazin and Tiberias. Look at what it says in verse 2. The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. That's what they called these seats in the synagogues. It would be the place where you would sit to teach everybody. You would read a portion of the scripture, and then you would sit down to teach everybody. And the Pharisees loved to sit in Moses' seat. They loved to get up in the synagogue and sit down and teach everybody. Now that's different than we teach, right? We teach standing up usually, right? I mean, I will get up and I will read a passage, and then I don't sit down. I just keep going, right? Matter of fact, I don't know if I could really even preach sitting down. I don't know if I feel like I'd be constrained, But that's how they did it. And so you see this. This is described even in the book of Luke, chapter 4, when Jesus is in the synagogue in Nazareth. It says that he got up and he read a portion of the book of Isaiah, and then he closed the book and sat down, and we think, oh, he's done. No. That's when he begins teaching. All the eyes are fixed on him, the Bible says, because he's about to now start teaching, and they're really confused because normally you'd read a long section. He read like a verse and a half and sat down and said, this day is this scripture being fulfilled in your eyes. And so that's the theme. That's like the thesis of his sermon. Like, Luke wasn't writing the whole sermon out. He's saying this is the theme that he started teaching them on, how he was fulfilling that in front of them. And so this is something that we can confirm. Only someone who lived in that time would know this. And then here's a really neat thing. Look at verse 27. I wanted to read all the way down at least to verse 27. And notice what it says here. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, tombs that are painted white. What is he talking about? Well, there are tombs that are painted white outside of Jerusalem. Right along the Mount of Olives and other places we've found tombs that are painted white. Now, you probably wouldn't know about this if you lived after 70 AD or in another place outside of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. Everything was just demolished, and we found this through archaeology. But there are a lot of tombs near the Mount of Olives that are painted white with lime. And the reason they painted, the Pharisees would go around painting tombs white as a warning, because if you touch a tomb, you're unclean for the rest of the day. And so they didn't want to accidentally go around and lean on a stone and, oh my goodness, it was a tomb, now I'm unclean. So they would go around painting tombs white. And Jesus said, that's you. You've painted yourself white like a tomb, but inside you're just as evil as you ever been. You make clean the outside of the cup. It's like I say to my kids after they do the dishes. Guys, the only part of this dish that's clean is the outside. I need to use the inside of it. And that's what Jesus is saying. Listen, you cleaned up the outside. Again, we could go on, and I will on Sunday, go on and on about this. But essentially, we can see then someone who lived during this time had to write the book of Matthew. That's very clear. So it's an authentic book. Let's talk about John very briefly. John wrote about specific locations in Jerusalem. Now, again, when we're talking, the reason I chose Matthew and John is because it's so clear. They're talking about things that would not be known after Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. What the Pharisees did in and around the temple, Matthew talks even about how they sound trumpets before them when they go in to give money and things like that, and that's on the Sermon on the Mount and all that kind of stuff. The things that are happening in and around Jerusalem are going to be completely lost after 70 AD, and the only way you can learn about them is from people like Josephus or the apostles or people who wrote about them, who lived and saw them. And so John writes about specific locations in Jerusalem. Let's talk about the pool of Bethesda. Go with me to John chapter 5. John chapter 5, there's this pool mentioned. After this, verse 1 says, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool. Now this statement, there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market, has led some to believe that maybe John was written earlier than 70 AD, though others believe that the Gospel of John was the latest gospel written in the 90s AD. But it might have been before 70 AD. Either that or he maybe started writing it and finished it in 90, and this part was written before 70, because he says there is at Jerusalem a pool by the sheep. There is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool. Now it also could be that the pool's still there. Jerusalem's destroyed, but the pool's still there. I mean, the pool didn't go anywhere, right? It'd be covered in stones and stuff. You wouldn't be able to find it, but it's still there. So maybe that's what he's writing. He's writing about it as if it were still accessible, even though it's not. But there is at the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. Now, this was discovered in the 19th century by Charles Wilson, I think it is. Yeah, Charles Wilson and Charles Warren. It was excavated in the 20th century. And essentially, they found that this seemed to be that the Romans set up sort of a shrine over this pool because it would randomly bubble up. It was a spring that would randomly bubble up. And they set up a shrine for a pagan god of healing. And that's why people were sitting around the pool. They believed that when the waters bubbled up, a pagan god would come and heal them. That's why there's a note here that says, for an angel went down at a certain season. That's not to say an actual angel went down. It's to say that was why they were sitting around the pool. They felt like an angel was coming down when it bubbled. They thought that that's what was going to happen. And we've confirmed that with archaeology, that is indeed what was going on at this pool. So now this gives us a lot of context too. Jesus is going to a place where a bunch of pagans are waiting for a pagan god to heal them. And he's saying, are you going to sit here and wait for the healing that you're not going to get? Guess who would get into the pool first when it bubbled? People who have legs, people who have less severe diseases. And guess what? They leave thinking they're healed, because that's what happens when you think you're healed of a disease that's not all that bad, right? You feel a lot better. Hey, I'm healed. And you go. And then you end up with the same disease again in a couple weeks and wonder what you did to anger the God, right? So here's a guy who's waiting for the moving of the waters. Jesus comes and he places his faith in Jesus instead and finds real healing. But anyway, at any rate, the point is that we found the pool. There's the pool, picture of it. It's the pool of Bethesda. They found the 5 porches, all that kind of stuff. There's also a mention in John chapter 9 of another pool, the pool of Siloam. This is mentioned by Josephus. He mentions the pool of Siloam in Book 5 of the Jewish War, chapter 4, section 1, if you want to look it up. And in June 2004, during sewer repairs near Gaihan Spring, workers stumbled on ancient steps and archaeologists excavated the Pool of Siloam. There it is. There's the Pool of Siloam. We didn't know until 2004 that this thing really existed. The only people who knew that this place actually existed were people alive before 70 AD, like Josephus and evidently John. So we're saying that these books are authentic. That's what we're saying. All right, so we've got that they are authentic. So we've looked at places, we've looked at the names that shows that these are written at the times and in the places where they're supposed to. Now we look at the places that are mentioned in the Bible, and the biblical authors speak accurately of little-known places destroyed shortly after their time. This shows the authenticity of the time period and location or locale of the author. With the time we have left, let's just dip our toe into part 2 of authenticity, and that is external evidence, because external evidence is going to go from verifying who wrote the books and when they wrote them, all the way to starting to show you that they were written accurately. So we're going to look at, we're going to take a book like John, and we're going to say, what other books that are written during the first century prove that John was written during the first century, or shortly after that, what other books written during the first century or shortly after it. So we'll start with other Christian sources, because obviously other Christians would know John, right? Other Christians who wrote during the first century would know John. Let's start with a guy named Papias. This is a source from somewhere early in Christian history. This would be 60 A.D. He wrote at the earliest around 60 A.D., which would be 30 years after Jesus' ministry. At the latest, it would be 130 A.D. We don't have any actual documents directly from Papias, but we do have a historian about 200 years later who wrote that he had a copy of Papias, and he quoted a few things that Papias said in his library. Now, his library is gone, but we have Eusebius's books that he wrote today, and we know then what some of the things Papias said. So here's what Eusebius says that Papias said, and Papias would have been somebody who would have known the apostles. Well, he wrote both of Matthew and Mark. Let me read you a little bit of what he said about Matthew and Mark. He said this: "The elder used to say, Mark, in his capacity as Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately as many things as he recalled from memory, though not in an ordered form." By the way, Papias probably knew Mark. He certainly knew apostles like John. So this is a very good source. He says that this is how Mark wrote down the book of Mark. "Not in an ordered form of the things either said or done by the Lord, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But later, as I said, Peter, who used to give his teachings in form of anecdotes, but had no intention of providing an ordered arrangement of the logia of the Lord. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong when he wrote down some individual items just as he related them from memory, for he made it his one concern not to omit anything that he had heard or falsify anything." So Papias tells us that Peter spoke a lot about his accounts of what happened in the ministry of Jesus, and Mark decided to write them down. And that's what we have in the book of Mark. That's why, by the way, if you look at the end of the book of Mark, I just noticed this, I was reminded of it again. I had noticed it before. But if you notice the end of Mark, Mark chapter 16, verse 7, and this happens all throughout the book of Mark, but when other apostles, other gospel writers talk about how Jesus is talking to the apostles, Mark will talk about Peter specifically, because Peter's his source. And so in Mark 16:7, when Jesus is risen from the dead, it says, "But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee." Well, why Peter? Because Mark wants everyone to know Peter's my source. I didn't get it from all the other disciples. I got it from Peter. And so he'll mention Peter when other apostles just say all of the disciples. Very interesting. And again, this is confirmed. Papias also wrote this about the book of Matthew. He said, "Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language." Now, there's some debate over whether Matthew was originally written in Hebrew as a language, or whether he's talking about he wrote it to the Hebrew people who were speaking Greek, but he wrote it for their minds, like for their mindset. And what exactly Papias means, we don't know because we don't have Papias' original words. We have Eusebius quoting Papias. But either way, Matthew wrote to the Hebrews, and each one interpreted them as best as he could. We know this. If you look at the book of Matthew, you'll notice one thing about it. If you know anything about the difference between the Gospels, you'd start noticing that Matthew keeps on going to the Old Testament over and over and over again and calling Jesus the Messiah and the King and all this ancient Jewish stuff, because Matthew's writing to Jewish people to show that Jesus is the Messiah. Irenaeus of Lyons, 130 to 200 AD, so this is pretty close. He would have known people who were he would have been trained by people who knew John. So it's very close. He wouldn't have necessarily known John the Apostle, but he would have been very close to people who did. He wrote this: Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundation of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also did hand down to us writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded a book, the gospel preached him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also leaned on his breast, did publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Wow. This is a guy who would have known, he'd been, the person who trained him, he's a disciple of this person, would have been a very close companion of John. And he says, this is what happened. Now, what this means, if nothing else, is that these books were written before the time of Irenaeus, because Irenaeus already knew about the books, right? So what does that give us? Well, that gives us the first century. Again, we're confirming the authenticity of the books. Let me just give you a couple more, we'll close. I like to throw in the word close. It gives people hope. Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria. This is 150 to 215, similar time period. He spoke of the authors of all four Gospels. He said this: of all those who had been with the Lord, only Matthew and John left us their recollections. Matthew and John were the only two apostles who wrote down Gospels. Remember, Mark and Luke Mark wasn't an apostle. He was writing what Peter knew, and Luke was writing what Paul knew, and others. So he says, of all those who had been with the Lord, only Matthew and John left us their recollections, and the tradition is that they took to writing perforce. Matthew, having first preached to the Hebrews when he was about to go to others also, committed his gospel to writing in his native tongue to compensate those who he was leaving for the loss of his presence. So he seems to suggest that Matthew was first written in Greek, and then he translated it into Hebrew so he could really reach the Jews. Mark and Luke were published first, but John, who had all along preached without writing, was finally induced by his disciples to compose a gospel, which he did, giving a spiritual account as others had already treated the external facts. There's Clement of Alexandria. How about Clement of Rome? Now, Clement of Rome is a book, it's interesting. He never calls himself Clement. Clement of Rome is something, the title is not accurate. It's actually the elders that were at Rome in the 1st century AD. At the time, people say the reason they call it Clement of Rome is because the Roman Catholic Church needs a pope in Rome during this time, but all the evidence says that there was no head pastor in Rome. There was no bishop in Rome at the time. There were a bunch of elders, and there was no bishop. So here comes a letter from the Church of Rome sent out to other churches saying, hey, here's some things to keep in mind. And there's no head bishop. So the Catholic Church has gone back and said, oh, this was written by Clement. How do you know Clement existed? We don't know. We just decided that he did. And this is written by Clement. So it's not written by Clement. Clement's not the actual name. It's actually a group of elders. But they do mention, it is from the 1st century. It would have been like right after John died, maybe right before John died, but probably right after John the Apostle died. He died at the end of the 1st century. They say this, take up the epistle of the blessed apostle Paul the apostle. What did he first write to you in the beginning of the gospel? Truly he wrote to you in the Spirit concerning himself and Cephas, which is Peter, and Apollos, because even then you had made yourselves partisans. This is probably speaking about the writings of Luke in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Acts. Not the Gospel of Acts, but the Acts of the Apostles, where we do read about Apollos and all those. Ignatius of Antioch, which would be he died about 10 years later. So he was trained by the Apostle John. He was a good, close companion of John. He wrote to the Romans before he died. He wrote to the church in Rome, and he said, I do not command you as Peter and Paul did. They were apostles. I am a convict. They were free. I am a slave to this very day. He says Peter and Paul wrote letters to the Romans. Now, this makes sense because in the book of 1 Peter, he's talking to people who are scattered, probably the Jewish Christians who had been in Rome. And when the Jews were attacked in 70 AD, the Jews in Rome had to run away from Rome because they were in trouble, but being Jews. And so Peter wrote to the Jews who had been in Rome, and Paul wrote to the Romans in the book of Romans that we have. We have both of these books that Ignatius mentioned. He also mentioned the epistle in his epistle to the Philippians. Before he died, he said, "The Spirit makes utterance, saying, 'Do nothing without the bishop. Keep your flesh as the temple of God. Love unity.'" And he basically alludes to some of the things that John wrote. We don't know for sure that he was quoting John, but he alludes to it. So we could go on, but I'm saying even external sources outside of these books show us they had to be written by these people during this time. Everyone who knew these guys said they wrote these books, and we have other people quoting the books and talking about the books within a few years after they were written, which means they couldn't have been written 100 years later. The Council of Nicaea and Constantine, he invented Christianity. You ever heard that? If you watched I don't know, I think I never watched it. It was originally a book, The Da Vinci Code, and then they made it into a movie or whatever. And it was, Christianity was invented at the Council of Nicaea. Well, explain to me why hundreds of years before the Council of Nicaea, they're already talking about these same gospel accounts that we have in our Bible today. So we can confirm this. Actually, there's more. Next week, we'll keep going with the external accounts that talk about these books, and we'll go from confirming that they were written during that time by those people into other things that talk about the events that they talk about and show that what they're talking about is true. They're not just written at that time by those people, but they're true accounts of what they really were witnesses of. And some of this evidence is gonna be pretty cool. We have ancient carvings of Christians and what they did, and enemies of Christians making fun of Christians, and with graffiti on walls that we've found to show that what Christians really believed. Even their enemies knew that they believed this. So it's pretty interesting. So we're going to get into that next week, God willing. All right, let's pray. Father in heaven, you are our Father. We thank you that you are our teacher. We thank you that we've learned tonight. If we have, we know we've learned from you. We know that you're the one who's accomplished whatever work has been done in our hearts tonight. We thank you for it. And we thank you for the evidence, for your word. We pray you give us more and more boldness to preach these ancient, true texts with conviction, knowing that they are true. Even 2,000 years later, they are still true. And we thank you for all of this and pray this in Jesus' name.